Are you ready? Yeah. Okay. I'm ready if you're ready.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out for our Science on the Sound series. My name is John McCord. I'm the head of our public engagement and outreach program, and I have the pleasure of introducing our special guest tonight. Just a few announcements. If you are not signed up for our monthly newsletter, there is a sign-up sheet up here. We don't sell your email address. We just want to be in contact with you to let you know about programs like this and other things that we have coming up. Another educational event that we have coming up, actually almost a week from now, next Friday, is a program called From Tide to Table. This is an oyster tasting occasion. We're now in the month of the oyster, and in order to celebrate that, we're going to have an event here where you learn a little bit about oysters, you visit an oyster farm, you hear from oyster farmers, and an oyster event wouldn't be an oyster event if we didn't taste a whole bunch of oysters. Both raw and roasted Cousins oysters will be here for that. It's a lot of fun. Check out the flyer for more details and how to register online. That's going to happen on October 27th, which is almost a week away from where we are right now. I have the pleasure of introducing Allyson Ropp as our speaker today. Allyson Ropp is a North Carolina native with a passion for maritime archaeology. She obtained her master's degree from the program in maritime studies at ECU, and she is now a doctoral candidate in the ECU Integrated Coastal Sciences program. She was recently named to NOAA's Dr. Nancy Foster Scholars, class of 2023. Congratulations. Thank you. Her dissertation research aims to characterize and evaluate the degradation of wooden shipwrecks through the integration of archaeological, microbial ecology, hydrological, and geospatial methods.
Yeah, there's a lot of words. That is not what we're talking about.
That's a mouthful. This evening, she is going to do a program for us on an examination of the shipwrecks along Wimble Shoals, North Carolina. And so without further ado, Allyson.
Thanks, John. I'm glad you all are here. Welcome. As John said, we are not talking about my dissertation research. Maybe that'll be a future talk. We're going to talk about wrecks right along here in North Carolina, called Wrecked on Chicamacomico, an examination of the shipwrecks of Wimble Shoals. So, we're going to start with probably a wreck that everybody knows, the SS Merlot. You probably know Merlot Beach. This is where a lot of the sand is eroding out of right now. It's named after this vessel. So this is an oil steamer that was built before World War I. And in August of 1918, it was steaming north filled with oil right off our shoreline here. And all of a sudden, it exploded. There was an explosion followed by a second explosion. Right around what was the Wimble Shoals buoy. So we'll get to that in a second, but essentially there's a buoy offshore marking the shoreline, and right around this point, there were some explosions that were happening that caused the ship to split in two, catch fire, and go down. And so essentially what was going on as these explosions were happening, the life-saving station on shore at Chicamacomico was watching all of this happen. You see flames coming out of the ocean, you know something's not right, right? And so they're trying to figure out how to get out there. It took them 5 times to launch a lifeboat. While this was happening on shore, the men on the vessel were trying in earnest to get off. They had 3 lifeboats on the vessel. One of them launched not completely full, and it went into the burning sea and flipped over, and so those men were sitting there hanging on in the burning ocean, trying not to drown, but also trying not to burn. The other 2 filled up and were able to get off the vessel, but by that time they were exhausted, so they were kind of floating out there. And at the point at which the life-saving service eventually got out there, they rescued all but 9 of these men, most of whom were in the section with the flipped-over boat in that burning water. So they rescued those guys first, they brought them in, and then they went on the search for the other 2 remaining lifeboats and brought them in. This is one of the most famous rescues of the life-saving service in North Carolina, and it's one that everybody thinks about when they think of shipwrecks, particularly in the area of Wimble Shoals. However, there's a whole lot of other stories of wrecks that happened in that region. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today. So just to give you some context of where we are, the little laser. There we go. So this is where we're going to focus. So this is the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and as we zoom in, you can see these shoal lines right here, right? So these are sand ridges that have formed, and this is the area that we're exploring. This historical research was all conducted in part of a larger survey of this area offshore. But we're just going to talk about some of the things that we found in understanding this, contextualizing this area and the wrecks that were happening. And so this is just a plot of all of the shipwrecks that I found that wrecked in this area. Right, there's a lot of red dots. So there's a lot of stories of what was happening in this area and why these wrecks were happening here, what caused these wrecks to happen, and kind of how did we get to the point that we are today, and what does this tell us about some of these wrecks out there? So just to give you an overview of these different shipwrecks, we have everything from 18th century vessels to World War II vessels, some of which you can see sticking out of the water today. This is another World War II vessel. Some, when the waters are crystal clear, you can see from above. And so part of the reason this area is such an interesting place for shipwrecks, you may have heard all of this before, we have a number of different shoals, as I just mentioned. So you can see all of the sand getting washed out. So this sand is continuously getting washed in and out off of our beach. You can see it every day. I just learned from some gentlemen here that some of the sand getting washed out of Merlot is probably showing up further down in Salvo. So this is a continual process that's going on today. And it was going on back then too when a lot of these ships were out there. So we have these different sandbars. This gives you how deep the sediment is. And understanding this movement of sand. So this is from a master's thesis at ECU that was looking at these movements of sand in these different areas. But it's continuous. This is the new bridge, and it's a stunning photo. So the other thing that's causing a lot of these wrecks to happen or like play a role in this is all of the currents out there. So this is a graphic of the Gulf Stream changing in speed over the course of a year. And you can see all of that movement of water is really, really warm water that's pushing upshore right off of North Carolina. And what that brings together is that there's a whole lot of currents happening. So you've got cold water that's moving down, you've got warm, fast water that's moving up with the Gulf Stream. You've got a number of different smaller currents that are working in here that are creating lots of waves and difficult conditions for sailors to navigate in. And with these hot and cold waters and hot and cold, air, it's generating a lot of different forces and fog and storms and conditions that aren't conducive to sailing. So these are things that our sailors are having to deal with. And this just gives you an idea of how many ships we're navigating around today off of our shoreline. So all of those little white dots are all different vessels that are navigating around today. But the same thing was happening back in the 1800s, in the 1900s, and there are actually stories from Chicamacomico, which is down around near Avon, where people in the town would look out. So you're standing on the shore, you're looking out, and they would see between 75 and 80 vessels passing a day. And these are wooden sailing vessels, not the big old cargo ships that you can see that just sit out there for days now. So they're passing close enough to shore that these wooden sailing vessels can be seen. And so that's a lot of activity and a lot of people on the water that you're now navigating around storms. You're navigating around sandbars that you may or may not know where they are. And you're navigating around other ships. And you don't know how you're going to make decisions because unlike today where you can talk to each other, they could not do that back then. And there are no blinkers, unfortunately. So the shipping lanes were very amorphous at that point. So people were making decisions as they were going, and a lot of them may not have known the conditions here like we do today. So it made it for a very treacherous location, which at one point led to the creation of the life-saving service. And this is not just in North Carolina, this extended up and down the coastline of the United States as a means for helping these vessels. But early on, there were only a few. There weren't this is the extent of all of the life-saving services or stations that were eventually put into North Carolina, but we originally started with only 7 that were spaced across, and so these servicemen had large swaths of beach to cover in their walks around, to see if ships were in trouble, to see if people were calling for help, and if they were, they had to then run all the way back to their station, muster the crew, and then run all the way back up the beach to where they needed to launch and help these crew. And at that point, the ship could have been broken up, those men could have died, all sorts of things could have happened. So, with the wreck of the Metropolis in January of 1878, things changed for North Carolina's life-saving service. This was a devastating wreck. All lives were lost. They had a hard time spotting it from shore, and when they did eventually spot it from shore, the guy had to run all the way back to his home station, which was far away from where the ship beached. And by the time he got back, everything had been broken up, and everything was lost. And so what this did was it inspired the addition of all of these other life-saving service stations. And with that, they were able to help more ships that were running aground in this area and hopefully save more lives. And so in the area that we're looking at, we're going to talk about stories from 4 different stations, in particular, P Island, New Inlet, which is number 20, Chicamacomico, and Wimble Shoals or Cedar Hammock, which is around near where Salvo is today. So those are the stations that we're going to look at, and some of their stories of the wrecks the ships that they helped rescue is what we're going to explore in some of our exploration of shipwrecks today. So we're going to start the earliest that we have in this region, which is the Pocahontas. So the Pocahontas was built in 1829 in Baltimore, Maryland, for the Maryland and Virginia Steamboat Company. It was a 138-foot vessel that could accommodate 100 passengers. Throughout its career, before it eventually went down in 1862, it actually got stuck in a number of different storms and had to be refitted a couple of times. And interestingly enough, it carried a Siamese princess at one point when she was visiting the United States. So fun fact about the Pocahontas. So the Pocahontas was part of the Burnside expedition to North Carolina, and it served as a horse transport during the Civil War. And so in 1862, it had been chartered to carry a fleet of horses down to Hatteras from Baltimore. And there were around 113 horses on board, and most of them belonged to the Rhode Island 4th Regiment. So they were coming here to support the Union effort. And it ended up going aground during the storm, which is what is depicted here, and all but 24 of the horses were lost. So some of them did make it ashore. The ones they were able to cut loose that had been stored on the deck, but a number had been down in the hold and they couldn't get them out. And all 60 of the crew members were able to get to shore as well. So during this storm, the boiler ended up blowing and blowing up the ship. The steering gave way and the hull ended up leaking, and that's how they made it home, or that's how they wrecked. There we go. Words. Today, you can see the Pocahontas. It's located off the beach in Salvo. It's about 75 yards from shore. It's about 10 to 15 feet of water if you're interested in trying to explore it. I have been told you can't see it because of the water clarity, but maybe one day you can. So what is there is that we still have engine parts, we have the shaft, and we have part of the paddle wheel, which is what you see sticking out of the water on a good day. So as we move forward, this is the Annie Blackman. She was built in 1883 in New Jersey. She was a 3-masted coal and lumber schooner. She spent most of her career sailing up and down the east coast of the United States. Avoided most accidents. There's very few ships that you can say didn't get into any wrecks or minor incidents in their career, and she was one of them. But in the fall of 1889, she left Philadelphia for Jacksonville, Florida, with coal. And she was lost to about 2 to 3 miles north of New Inlet in a violent storm. She's being driven ashore and sprung a leak. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting stories that I have seen in doing this research. And so the crew was a complete loss except for the captain. And so can you imagine for a second that you're in a violent storm, you're on this vessel, you're trying to figure out how to do, you probably can't swim. There's only one life jacket. And so the captain got the life jacket. It was a cork life jacket. All of the rest of the crew, everybody was swept overboard. He had this life jacket. And he somehow, luckily enough, floated into the inlet where he ran across a pole. And he was able to tie himself to a pole for the night as the storm and the waters are all raging around him. And he stays there, and he stays alive. And the next morning, crystal clear weather, the Coast Guard, or the life-saving service finally sees what happened. They did not know this was happening. They couldn't see it. It was so dark that night that they didn't know that this wreck had happened. And so the serviceman is walking down to the inlet, and he sees this guy tied to this pole, half dead. And it amazes me, first of all, the sheer luck of this captain to be able to find this pole and survive in those conditions. But it is just a fascinating story to me to read about how this guy did this and was able to survive, but also sad that we didn't think of enough life jackets for the whole crew at that point. And now we do have that. So that was the Blackman. She has not been found, as far as I know. We haven't found any traces of her. That's not to say that some of these timbers that wash ashore aren't related to this vessel. A lot of these wooden vessels that we're talking about today, we may or may not be able to identify because of what they were, which is wood, and there were so many wooden vessels. This one is the Stead Harrowing. So this is an English vessel that was built in the early 1800s, and she was sailing from Cuba to Baltimore with iron ore. When off of Hatteras, she ran into a dense cloud of fog and immediately ran aground. She sent out a distress signal, and it alerted the life-saving station in Chicamacomico, so they rallied their troops to get out there and help them. Unfortunately, they couldn't see it from shore because the fog was so thick. So when the fog finally lifted a few hours later, the whole ship had been destroyed. The main mast was gone, the lifeboats were broken in pieces, the vessel was split in two, and 3 of the crew members, including the captain, had drowned by this point. And so they were able to get the Lyle gun, which was essentially a gun they shoot out there to send a line out to the vessel, out to the vessel to bring them in. They tried and tried and tried for 12 hours to get the remaining crew off of this vessel, and they succeeded in getting them off. Although some gave in and just jumped off the vessel and tried to swim to shore. That did not go very well for those gentlemen. But they were able to pull in 7 from the vessel. 10 died while trying to get to shore with the Lyle gun, and 9 died in other ways. But today, this vessel has been found and actually mapped by East Carolina and CSI. I believe John was involved with this one. So this is about 1.5 miles south of the Chicamacomico life-saving station. It's about 160 yards from shore. It is in diving limit, so it's 20 to 30 feet. And most of it's still there, so you can see the different components of it. And ECU has done a good job of showing us what is left compared to the plans. So we do have a lot more information about this wreck than we do some of the other ones. So the next one we have is the George L. Fessenden. This one was built in 1874 in Maine, also a 3-masted cargo schooner. Had a long 24-year career sailing up and down the East Coast into the Gulf of Mexico, carrying everything from coal lumber to molasses and ice. The story of this one is more in its long-term career prior to wrecking in North Carolina. There were a number of incidents that occurred with this vessel. So one of its cargoes was a cargo of molasses. And during a storm, all of the molasses disappeared. The records don't say how. Another incident was that the captain just disappeared one day in port. Like they got to port, captain completely disappeared after a delivery of coal and turned up in a psychiatric hospital. Yeah, so something was clearly going on with the captain of this vessel. But in April of 1898, the schooner had been loaded with crushed stone to go from Philadelphia down to Fort Caswell in Southport. It stopped at Hampton Roads. We have no idea why. It just pulled in, hung out for a few days, and left again. And here, it got here and it anchored. It decided 4 miles offshore, northeast of the Chicamacomico station, it was just going to stop and anchor. And it just sat there for days. And so the life-saving station is sitting there like watching, like what is going on? A passing steamer stopped and asked if they were okay. And they were like, yeah, we're fine. Oh, okay. So they keep going. There was no distress signal, nothing was happening. And at the end of April, so right as, this vessel had been sitting there for days, this huge storm blew up, and the life-saving station said, well, we're gonna see what happens. Maybe now there will be a distress signal. Maybe now, something will happen. Nothing came. They were sitting there watching. The vessel was still just hanging out in this storm, waiting for something. So finally, this ship is getting driven closer and closer to shore. And so finally, the life-saving station went, let's go save them. And so they finally left out, went and rescued them, brought them ashore. And what they were told was that the captain had drowned under unknown circumstances. And the ship was rotten, completely rotten. So I don't know if they just felt like they couldn't keep sailing it, so they just stopped. And they didn't know any of their other sailors. So the 4 guys they rescued apparently didn't talk to each other. So they didn't know what was going on. So they weren't sure if they should signal for help or not. So they just sat there and waited. The vessel was a complete loss. Those men were saved. But it's just such a fascinating story to me. Like the drama of this vessel it was so crazy. Anyways. Again, we have not found this ship. Maybe we have found pieces that have washed up on the beach in various different forms, but no contiguous site like we've seen for some other ones. The Alfred Braubrook was also a 3-masted schooner from Maine that was built in the 1870s. We're seeing a theme. A lot of our vessels that we know a lot about came from that area. So in March of 1899, it was carrying a load of ice for Charleston, South Carolina from Maine. It ran aground in a snowstorm. So at some point it did snow out here. Hello, dear friends. I hope you're prepared for the coming winter. So they were spotted by a patrolman from the Wimble Shoals station. And due to the conditions, the lifesavers were unable to help them for a few hours. They just couldn't get a vessel out there. It was too far away to shoot a gun. But eventually they were able to shoot the gun and send the breeches buoy out and rescue all of the people, but the vessel and the cargo of ice, shockingly, were a complete loss. That ice was not recovered. I know, we're all surprised. So we have another 3-masted schooner. This one's from New Jersey. This is the Montana. This one was laden with salt and a crew of 7 bound for Charleston from New York when it ran aground about a 1/4 mile north of the P Island station, about 300 yards from shore. They signaled to shore. They tried to let them know that something was going on, and the crew had hidden up in the rigging. So they had climbed all the way up the mast, and they were trying to stay out of the wind and the rain and the waves and stay on the vessel. And so the life-saving service at P Island were ready to go. Another snowstorm, by the way. We got more snow. I know. I don't associate snow with out here, but I guess in the early 1900s, there was a lot of snow. So unfortunately, they couldn't reach these guys at that night. The conditions were too bad. They couldn't fire the gun. They couldn't launch the boat. So they had to wait until daybreak to go out and rescue the crew. Eventually, they got the line out there with the breeches buoy to bring everybody in. But everybody except for one survived. He got washed overboard, but the vessel, again, was a complete loss. Haven't found it. So we keep progressing. We have the Loring C. Ballard, another three-masted schooner from Maine. Maine was big with shipbuilding. From the 1880s. This one was traveling north or south in April of 1915 in ballast. So it didn't have any cargo on it. It just was going to Charleston to pick up a cargo for its next journey. And so this one wrecked in something we're very familiar with. A hurricane caused it to drive ashore a half a mile from the Gold Store station. It was seen by the life-saving service. They were watching this happen. And they were able to get the Lyle gun out there and successfully land the shot on the first try. But as they were getting ready to send out the breeches buoys and bring these guys to shore, the vessel shifted in that storm and in the sand, and the line dropped. And so they had to do it again, and they were able to bring everybody home. We have found this vessel. This is what it looks like. You can see it in the surf. It's about 2.5 miles south of Ramp 23. Like some of the other beach wrecks, it comes and goes with the sand as the sand moves around it. So you may not, if you go out there tomorrow, it may not be visible. But we do know this one stays pretty stationary where it is. I do not believe it's been mapped that I know of, but you can go visit this one. So as we progress forward, we now have a vessel that was built in the 1900s. This is the Elizabeth. She was built in 1904 in Delaware as a cargo carrier. In March of 1919, she was traveling past North Carolina on her way to New York from the West Indies with a cargo of sugar. She ran aground 3 miles offshore, so she's one that's further out there, is a little far for the life-saving service to rescue. So she ran aground on Wimble Shoals and began taking on water. And so they alerted the life-saving station as best they could, and they were preparing on shore to try to help these sailors that were out there, and really trying to wait for it to get driven closer to shore. So as the waves are pushing it, they're hoping that it was just going to get a little bit closer, that they could get out there more successfully. As this was all happening, a tug had passed on its way from a tug had arrived from Norfolk to help rescue them. And all of the crew were rescued from the vessel, but the vessel was a complete loss. We have not found this one. It is somewhere on the shoals, and with it being on the shoals, it means that the sand is probably moving over it constantly. So finding it is kind of almost looking for a needle in a haystack for us. Maybe one day the sands will move enough to reveal something of interest that we could go dive and see what's there. But the Elizabeth still remains lost to today. The Governor Ames is probably one of my favorites that I learned about in all of this. This is the first 5-masted wooden schooner to sail on the Atlantic Oceans that was built in the United States. And she had a terrible first few months of her life. She was completed, she went out for her sea trials, and she broke 3 of her masts right away. And they had to take her back in and give her some new masts. But she ended up sailing all the way to Australia and all the way back to England and then back to the United States, and spent the rest of her life sailing up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States. In December of 1919, she left Georgia with a series of with a stack of railroad ties to go to New York. And in heavy seas, she ended up hitting Wimble Shoals. So it's another one that was lost out on the shoals. And there was one sailor that survived, and he told a harrowing story of his night aboard the wrecking of this vessel that made it in all the big newspapers. And essentially, every time he found a place to hold on, he's sitting there watching all of his fellow seamen get washed off the ship. And he kept moving. He kept trying to find where to go. The wife's captain was aboard this vessel when it got stuck in this storm and went down. And I don't know if I fully understand the reasoning behind why you tie somebody to a mast, but they thought in her best interest they would tie her to a mast to keep her safe. That did not end well. So what happened to this guy, he made it ashore, so he He got eventually washed off this vessel like everybody else, but was able to grab onto something, floated at sea for like 2 days before a passing vessel spotted him and brought him aboard. And they brought him back to shore, and he got nursed back to health, and then he told this story for the rest of his life. So we have a full accounting of the wrecking of the Governor Ames. The Governor Ames, kind of like the Elizabeth, has yet to be found as a wooden vessel out on the shoals. It could be buried by sand. It could have been completely broken up, and just fragments of it are what we see now washing ashore as plank timbers and frames come ashore. One day, maybe we will find the 5-masted schooner. So the G.A. Kohler is one you may all be familiar with because it is one that we can see currently today. So this was built in Wilmington, Delaware in 1919 as a 4-masted schooner. Worked out in New York, sailed down to South America a number of times. In 1923, was sold to a different company in Baltimore and renamed the G.A. Kohler after the owner, I believe the owner of the company. A tobacco magnate from Pennsylvania who had an interest in the company. And at that point, they added some auxiliary engines to give it some power besides sailing power. And, it started with those auxiliary engines, and then when the company bought it, they removed the auxiliary engines, and it was just a sailing vessel. Got that backwards. And it was regularly running trips from Baltimore to Florida with various cargoes. And so in 1933, the vessel was towed out of Baltimore to sail to the West Indies when it ran aground in North Carolina. And here it is sitting smack on the beach where you can still see it today. So essentially, it got stuck in a storm. The captain decided to anchor because he wasn't familiar with the area, all of these shifting sandbars. It's really hard to navigate in a storm anyway, so he left it there. Things just kept getting heavier and heavier with the winds and the rains and the waves that the anchor line eventually snapped as they were sitting 12 miles out to shore and just got slowly driven on shore, as we can see here. And by the time they were able to get to it and try to get it out, it had become too embedded in the soil or the sand and the sediment on the beach that they just said it's unsalvageable. And they've left it, and you can see images of it changing over time to what it is today. So people would go out there, they would take stuff off or their homes, whatever they needed, but eventually time and the physical dynamics of the environment led to this beautiful vessel that you can see here today. It sits a few miles south of Salvo on the beach, so you can go see it. It's another one like the Ballard that gets covered and uncovered in various storm conditions. And we have some really cool shots of it from locals like yourselves taking drones out to shoot it when it does appear. And most of it's there. So if you want to go on a shipwreck tour, if you're inspired, please go see it. So, now that we've heard some of these fun stories, what do they tell us about how wrecks were happening off of North Carolina? So that was really part of me digging into all of these stories, was to kind of pull some trends out. Were more wrecks happening as ships were traveling north? Were more wrecks happening as ships were traveling south? What was happening in the summer versus the winter? What can we see in these different trends? And so what we have in this specific search area is that we have 204 wrecks that we identified and could give a general location of where they were, which is all these red dots. And so we plotted them to look at where they were and understand how close they were to shore, when they wrecked, why they wrecked, and which direction they were traveling. There's 74 in total that we knew very little about. We know they wrecked somewhere in this general vicinity, have no other information other than that. So those are excluded from understanding this larger picture of wrecking patterns here. So first, how are these related in terms of where they are from shore? And this one should be fairly straightforward for you. Most of them are on shore. So we have lots of stories of all of the wrecks that are happening in this area between the island and this first line here. So all of our green wrecks, those are the ones that we're calling onshore. And most of the stories that we know about why they happened, how they happened, everything we know about them is because the life-saving service was involved in them some way. Either someone made it ashore from that wreck happening and they're able to tell that story, or the life-saving service is sitting there watching this happen, trying to rescue them, and just happened to not succeed at that point. Then we have this space in here, which we're calling our near-shore wrecks. Some of these the life-saving service was able to save, and some of them they were not. And then we have our offshore wrecks all out here that we just know of through various reporting of vessels passing by, other accounts, particularly from war. A lot of these are later period wrecks related to World War the 20th century. And so what we see is essentially a lot of them are clustered on shore, and a lot of them are clustered where our life-saving stations would be. So there's a station here. We have the Chicamacomico station here. This is what New Inlet would have been. So there's some clustering that we're seeing based on how close they are to shore. And there you had it. That was the count. Lots are ashore. So that it's not surprising when you're thinking about how sailors were moving around and the shoals that we have, that people would want to kind of use the shoreline as a guide for navigating, right? They may have had maps, but they still needed some sort of bearing to know where they were. And the shoreline here is a great tool to use, but you kind of have to be close to it to see it. During the survey, we were about 8-9 miles off, and we could see the construction of the bridge in Rodanthe, but we couldn't really see much else at the further and further we got offshore. So it makes sense, if you're thinking about it, that a lot of wrecks would have happened in close proximity to shore because it was a guide for them to think about and to utilize navigating around. So now that we know where they were kind of wrecking, can we see any patterns of when they were wrecking based on the month and the year? And so if we'll take the years first. So this is split into different categories. The colors are based on, that you're seeing, are based on the what is the word I'm looking for? Century. And then the chart there is based on decades. And so we have most of them are coming from the 1800s because that's when a lot of these vessels were out there. That is the period of time where we have the most vessels on the water around the world because that was our main mode of transportation. It was our main mode of trade. So lots of ships were on the water. And then as you get into the 1900s, that's when we start getting better navigation. They can go further offshore. They can avoid, we know what's underwater at that point. We can start seeing, using, side scan and fish finders and bottom finders to know where the bottom is so they can avoid all of these depths or these shallow depths and go further offshore. So we're seeing less and less wrecks as you move forward in time. Interestingly, it seems like there is some clustering happening with our time periods. And this early period here is when you've got low counting for the life-saving service. That's before the life-saving service really had picked up. It was there, it was present, but more and more wrecks were happening at that point because there weren't people there to help them. And then there's some war. This is all war. There's some war in here that's causing some wrecks. But there doesn't appear to be a strong spatial patterning in where these wrecks were occurring based on when they were happening, based on age. So if we look at the months, I was more curious in how does this follow our storm patterns, right? So we have hurricane season in the summer and the fall, and then we get nor'easters in the winter. So are we seeing patterns like that? And we were seeing patterns in the stories, right? I told you a lot about snowstorms. Who knew? More snowstorms than hurricanes. So we do see some patterning happening, that there's more wrecks happening when there's more storms happening, which makes sense. if these captains don't know how to navigate around here and then they encounter a storm, the safest thing would be for them to anchor up. And that also causes problems, as we saw in a number of stories where they were being pushed ashore during those storms, even if they stopped. So lots of things to think about as a captain. So why were they wrecking? This one got real confusing really fast because all of these things kind of mean the same thing if you think about it. Running aground, being stranded, going down in a storm probably meant you ran aground. So there's not a whole lot of patterns we see here other than the running aground, the strandings are all fairly close to shore. The war losses are all further out, which does make sense because at that point we knew where these shoals were, that they could avoid them. So they'd go further offshore to try to avoid those shoals. And at that point they ran into U-boats and everything else that was off of our shores. So what direction were they traveling? This one I thought would be interesting because if you're thinking back to those currents, you've got the big Gulf Stream going here. And so if you're going south, you want to avoid that because it's pushing you north. So you'd have to work harder to go against it. And so were they taking into consideration that they would be threading a needle here to go through shoals to avoid the Gulf Stream, to go south? And so there are some distinct patterns that we were seeing more than we were seeing in any other one in terms of the directionality of these wrecks. And so a lot of we have a ton of ones that we have no idea what direction they were happening. So if we ignore the blue for a second and just look at the red and the pink, which in hindsight probably wasn't the greatest color combination to show you all. But we have significantly more of our southern wrecks than northern wrecks, and all of our southern wrecks are on shore or very close to shore. When compared to our northern ones, which are that they start to spread out more. And so fitting it to that model, the currents that I just told you about, you've got this dynamic, right? So if you're a captain, you've got a decision to make. Do you stay in this nice southern moving water that's closer to shore, where you may or may not know their shoals are, or do you come out here and potentially get in this fast-moving water that's going the complete opposite direction of what you want to do? And so this decision was a big one that we see kind of play out in the data and the decisions that they had to make. How much they knew about this as captains, I don't know. That's not something that I've looked into in terms of what they knew or didn't know. But it's interesting to see in the data that we have from all of these stories of wreckings where ships are kind of sorting out based on these two dynamics of human decisions and the existing environment. And so what we essentially are seeing in these different patterns is that there's clustering towards shore and they decrease as they move away, which naturally makes sense. We either don't know about them out there or they just weren't happening because they didn't have a chance to run aground. They could anchor and be safe. Most occurred during the 19th century, which makes complete sense with how many vessels were on the water. They tend to occur during those stormier seasons. We see no very real pattern in why they were wrecking. And most of the southbound vessels were wrecking closer to shore, where our northbound vessels were occurring further away. And so that is all I have for you. Thank you for listening to all of the fun stories. I'm happy to take any questions you may have about this or my very convoluted, illogical dissertation that I did not talk about today. So yeah, we have some microphones that we'd like you to use.
We've got 25 people online watching, and it's being recorded, so they want to hear your questions too. So please take the microphone if they offer one to you.
If you don't have any questions, that's cool too. It means I did a great job.
What time frame did the technology start being implemented that would help them navigate and be able to get offshore a little bit more and not rely on lighthouses and so forth?
Yeah, that would have been, I believe, around like the First World War or First World War. So like the early 1900s, obviously they had been crossing like transatlantic and transoceanic voyages for a while. But a lot, those were more trained than, say, your average captain that just like wandered out of a city at some point by the time they needed all of these captains. So we have sounding charts from the 1800s, but how many people knew how to use that is up for debate, and how quickly they changed, right? We can go out there today and probably do a lot of this stuff really, really fast, where back then they, would do it once and then probably do it again in another 20 years. So my guess, I think most of that technology started to come around the time of the early 1900s. And then definitely after the First World War, we're starting to see more and more of that technological boom.
This was not really part of your conversation, but what in the world was the mortality rate of the life-saving crews? I mean, they seem to be doing awfully dangerous work.
Yeah, I have no idea. That's a great question. From what I can gather from the few books I've read, some stayed in it for a very long time, the ones that survived. I haven't seen anything per se about the mortality, but a lot of it were local. So it was a way to like fund or to support local communities. Like it seems to me that they rarely brought in outsiders, at least in the terms of the general life-saving serviceman. The captain, the person in charge, may have been from another area, but I believe most of them were long-timers in terms of they would stay with it for a while. So I don't know about the mortality, but they stayed in it. And there was some other point I had to that, and now I can't remember what it was. Oh, they had seasons. So there seemed to be some seasonality, at least in the early stages, to the life-saving service. Like they would close down for a few months out of the year. And I believe that was during the winter, which may also suggest why there's more wrecking and loss of life during that time period.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hey, what about celestial navigation? I know, just to get the shipping lanes offshore a little bit, it's not that hard to learn.
Yeah.
I did it.
Yeah. I mean, they definitely did it. But, during the day or during the storm, like, you're not necessarily going to be able to see that. So it was definitely a means to navigate, especially when you're offshore. But, if you're onshore, if you can just follow the shoreline, it does make life a little easier, especially if you don't have the tools to do it. If the ship wasn't complete with that set of tools to be able to navigate via the stars. I know, it's complicated.
The sextant, yeah. Thank you.
We got an online question as well. George Bonner would like to know, did lightships have a positive impact on maritime safety off of North Carolina? And was a lightship off of Wimble Shoals ever considered?
I'm sure they had a positive impact. The lightships, I actually have never looked into lightships. I do know we had them. I do not think one was ever considered off of Wimble, though. There was a buoy out there for a long period of time, but I don't think they ever thought about a lightship out there that I know of. Yes, yeah.
Do you know when where most of the early iron ships were wrecked?
When the early iron ships were wrecked. So we started as a group of people to make iron ships in the late 1800s, and then they really became the dominant type, and in the early 1900s is when iron was the big thing. So most of the iron wrecks would date to that early 1900s. Because at that point, especially after World War II, we got really good at not losing vessels to the frequency that we do in the 1800s. Yes?
Regarding the lifesavers, I think the mortality rate was extremely low. P Island didn't lose a lifesaver, Etheridge's crew. With respect to lighthouses, when the lady brought up lighthouses, did that have any impact on the shipwrecks? Were there more or less, when the lighthouses were, especially Body Island and Hatteras, which I guess were the...
I mean, yeah, see, we're just a little south of Body, right? So they could have, but they, I actually don't know. The lighthouses weren't in this area that I considered. That's not to say they didn't help, but you could also be confused by them. I think there are stories of sailors just being totally confused by lighthouses if they didn't know they're there. But it seems like they would help. But again, if some of these captains and sailors don't necessarily know the area or what they're doing, and there was a guidebook for all of this information, and if they didn't look in that guidebook or really understand what that guidebook was saying, it could be a hindrance in a way, I would think. But human error, I think, is really what we see in a lot of this stuff.
So now I'm curious about your convoluted dissertation.
Sure. Happy to answer it later, or I can tell you right now. We have time, right? Okay. So my dissertation, so I'm actually working not in North Carolina, I'm working in the Mallows Bay Potomac River National Marine Sanctuary, which is about an hour south of Washington, D.C. It's right across the Potomac River from Quantico. So every time we go up there, we hear all the helicopters, and it's very exciting. And so essentially what I'm looking at is how that wooden ship, my case study site is degrading based on a number of different factors. And so we're measuring the microbial diversity. So we go out there and we take scrapings of the biofilm and the algae that's growing on the wreck to identify who's in it, and does that tie to areas of degradation that we're seeing. So we have this big old drill that drills into the side of the wreck with this little tiny drill needle, and it's measuring the force that is needed to push into the wood as that needle is going in. And from that, we can calculate how dense that wood is. So the softer it is, the easier it is to push that needle in, and likely the more degraded it is. And so the vessel that I'm working on is part of a World War I fleet of shipwrecks. And so during World War I, when the United States finally entered the war, we didn't have a standing Navy like we do today. We had people, we had the sailors, we had the men, but we didn't have the ships. And so they implemented this huge shipbuilding program. And, sorry. So part of that shipbuilding program was to build the iron and steel fleet of the destroyers and the battleships and the cruisers to fight the war. And the other half, one guy in DC had this crazy idea of building a fleet of wooden vessels to build a bridge to Europe to ferry all the supplies that they needed for the war. And at this point, wooden shipbuilding was kind of falling out of phase. It wasn't the thing anymore. We had depleted a lot of the forest that we needed for the wood, to build all these vessels that we needed in the 1800s. So like the Adirondacks in New York and Vermont, all of those forests had been completely decimated by this time. And so they implemented this huge shipbuilding program to build like 1,000 wooden vessels. And they got shipyards across the country to build these vessels. They tried to find all of this wood, but what ended up happening partially was that the war ended so quickly by the time that they got around to actually implementing and successfully building these ships. So the war itself ending caused the end of the program. But the ships they did finish, which they finished about 200, When they finally launched the first 100 on July 4th of 1918, it was this big launching across the country, they realized that all of the designs of the ships themselves, the steering capabilities, they were all terrible. Like, it was the complete failure of a program. And so what they ended up doing was the Navy was stuck with this fleet of like half-completed, really bad ships. And so they sold them all to a salvage company, and a lot of them were brought up to the Potomac River for salvage. You can see a number of them throughout the country. There was a big, about a month ago, there were a couple of news articles coming out of Texas about ships being seen in a river, like wrecks being seen in a river. Those are from the same fleet. So they were just being abandoned in various different places around the country. There's a huge line of them, and I think it's Washington State, that serve as like a breakwater for one of the rivers. And so the salvage company drug them up into the Potomac, the ones they bought, to burn them and strip them, get all the iron out, and the machinery and everything they needed. And they were doing it on the Virginia side of the river, kind of right in the Navy's backyard, as you do, because the Navy was like, sure, fine. And then one day, the few that they were trying to salvage at that point up by the Navy yard, or by Quantico, caught fire. And the Navy was like, no, you got to get them out of here. Like, no. So they moved them across the river into what is now Mallows Bay, or what was Mallows Bay, that was completely empty. And they set up this huge salvage operation. And there's 100 of these vessels left in the bay. And so my advisor really wanted to work up there. We had this great partnership with the NOAA Maritime Heritage Program, with the National Marine Sanctuary. So it's kind of a natural fit to kind of look at how conditions are changing in relation to like our changing environment in this very static place where things are changing around it, but those wrecks are really kind of stable in the grand scheme of things. They were completely abandoned in the 50s. And by the 70s, when a lot of people were like, oh gosh, we have to remove these. These are like an eyesore. They're not great. The environmentalists actually stepped in and said, we can't move them now because they've completely altered the dynamics of the bay. So they're providing habitat to all of the fish. Like a lot of them are growing trees on them. If you want to look it up, it's called the Ghost Fleet of Mallows Bay. It's really cool to kayak around. But they've completely altered the environment, and so they've since become part of this National Marine Sanctuary. And so I'm trying to understand how this ship, one of these ships, wrecks, is kind of changing. So it's like a case study for the larger bay and hopefully extending into understanding just wooden shipwreck degradation in general that can be kind of extended to other environments potentially in terms of like what we should be measuring to understand how these sites are going to change as our conditions change. So yes, that was the long logical thing that John tried to read.
We are in need of wrapping up, actually. So thank you, Allyson, very much for coming out, and thank you all for attending tonight. We hope you'll join us next time.
Thanks, everyone. I'm happy to still answer your questions.